The night was dark and eerie as a group of friends made their way to an ancient cemetery located in the heart of the city. They had heard rumors of a powerful medium buried there and decided to perform a seance to try to communicate with her. As they entered the cemetery, the air grew thick and heavy, and they could feel the weight of the centuries-old tombstones surrounding them. They found an open area and set up their candles and planchette, their breaths visible in the chilly night air. As they placed their hands on the planchette, they closed their eyes and began to call out to the medium. Suddenly, the planchette began to move on its own, spelling out words that made their hearts skip a beat. They tried to let go, but their hands were stuck to the planchette, and they were unable to move. The wind picked up, and the candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows around them. The temperature continued to drop, and they could feel an icy chill creeping up their spines. Suddenly, they heard a faint whisper, and the tombstones around them began to shake and rattle. Their fear turned to terror as they realized they had awakened a malevolent spirit, and it was now fully present among them. They tried to run, but the spirit held them captive, and they were unable to escape its wrath. They were trapped at the mercy of the vengeful ghost that they had summoned with their foolishness. Panic set in as the spirit's presence grew stronger, and the friends could hear its angry breaths in the darkness. The candles were now blown out, and they could barely see each other in the pitch-black cemetery. The sound of footsteps echoed around them, and they could sense that the spirit was getting closer. Suddenly, one of the friends felt a cold hand on their shoulder, and they let out a blood-curdling scream. They all turned to look, but there was no one there. The hand was still gripping tightly, and they could feel the icy grip of death on their skin. The friends tried to run, but their legs were like jelly, and they could barely move. They could hear the spirit's laughter as it chased them through the cemetery. Its presence now felt more strongly than ever before. Finally, they stumbled upon a small chapel in the center of the cemetery and ran inside, slamming the door shut behind them. They could hear the spirit pounding on the door, its fury growing by the second. They knew they had to finish the seance, or they would never be able to leave the cemetery alive. With trembling hands, they set up the planchette once again, and as they placed their hands on it, the temperature in the chapel dropped drastically. The candles flickered, and the planchette began to move on its own once again, spelling out a message from the angry spirit. They quickly finished the seance and said a prayer, hoping to appease the spirit and end its wrath. The pounding on the door stopped, and the temperature returned to normal. The friends breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that they had survived the night. However, they knew they would never forget the terror they had experienced in that cemetery, and they made a promise to never perform a seance again. As the friends left the chapel, they could still feel a sense of unease settling over them. They walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, replaying the events of the night in their minds. Suddenly, they heard a low growling noise, and they turned to see a pack of wild dogs stalking them. The dogs were foaming at the mouth, and their eyes glowed in the darkness. The friends ran, but the dogs were too fast, and soon they were surrounded. The friends were trapped, and they could feel the dogs' hot breath on their skin. They knew they had to fight for their lives, so they picked up sticks and rocks, and prepared to defend themselves. The dogs attacked, snarling and biting, but the friends managed to fend them off. They were covered in scratches and bruises, but they had survived once again. They continued running until they reached a busy street, where they collapsed in a heap, their hearts racing with adrenaline. As they sat there catching their breath, they realized that they had disturbed something that was best left alone. They had played with forces beyond their understanding, and they had paid a heavy price. They made a vow to never speak of that night again, to bury the memory deep inside and never let it resurface. They knew that they had been lucky to escape with their lives, but they also knew that they would never forget the horror of that night and the terrible consequences of playing with the unknown. Days turned into weeks, and the friends tried their best to put the terrifying events of that night behind them. They went back to their normal lives, trying to forget the fear and the horror they had experienced. But something was different. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them. Strange occurrences began to happen, unexplainable things that left them questioning their sanity. One friend began to hear whispers in the night, voices that spoke in languages they couldn't understand. Another friend claimed to have seen a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of their room, watching them as they slept. The friends tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination, that they were still haunted by the memory of that night. But they couldn't deny the feeling that something was not right. Finally, they decided to seek the help of a psychic, hoping to find answers and put an end to the nightmares that had been plaguing them. The psychic listened to their story and nodded solemnly, confirming their worst fears. "You have awakened something," she said, "and it is not happy. You must make it right, or it will never let you go." The friends were terrified, realizing that they had been playing with forces beyond their understanding. They knew that they had to do something to appease the spirit, or they would be doomed to a life of terror and fear. Together, they returned to the cemetery, armed with offerings and a solemn prayer. They begged the spirit for forgiveness, promising to never disturb its peace again. As they left the cemetery, they felt a sense of relief wash over them, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they knew that they had been forever changed by the horror they had experienced. They had learned a valuable lesson, that some things were better left alone, that some secrets were better left buried. Despite their efforts to move on, the friends couldn't escape the feeling that something was still watching them, still haunting them. They tried to ignore it, but it was always there, like a dark cloud hanging over their heads. One night, as they sat together in a local bar, they heard a familiar voice behind them. They turned to see an old man, his eyes glowing in the dim light, a strange smile on his face. "You shouldn't have disturbed the spirits," he said, his voice cold and eerie. The friends froze, realizing that this was the same man they had seen in the cemetery that night, the one who had warned them to leave before it was too late. "What do you want from us?" one of the friends asked, his voice trembling. The old man just smiled, his eyes gleaming with a dark intensity. "I want nothing from you," he said, "but the spirits do. They demand justice for the disturbance you caused." The friends tried to run, but the old man was too fast, his grip like iron. He led them to a deserted alleyway, where they saw a group of hooded figures waiting for them. The friends were surrounded, their backs against the wall, as the hooded figures chanted in a language they couldn't understand. The air grew cold, and they could see their breaths in the darkness. Suddenly, the figures stopped chanting, and the old man stepped forward, a knife glinting in the moonlight. "You must pay for your transgressions," he said, his voice like ice. The friends screamed, but it was too late. The old man plunged the knife into their chests, and they fell to the ground, their lives slipping away. As the hooded figures disappeared into the darkness, the friends' spirits rose from their lifeless bodies, trapped forever in the cemetery, haunted by the horrors they had unleashed. As the sun began to rise, a group of joggers stumbled upon the gruesome scene in the alleyway. They called the police, who arrived shortly after to investigate the brutal murders. The authorities searched for the killers, but they were never found. The case remained unsolved, and the friends' families were left to mourn their loss and wonder what had happened that night. Years passed, and the cemetery became a place of legend, a cautionary tale told to young people to keep them from dabbling in the occult. But the spirits of the friends remained trapped, unable to rest, forever haunted by the horrors they had unleashed. One night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the cemetery, despite the warnings. They laughed and joked, unaware of the danger that lurked around them. As they wandered through the rows of gravestones, they heard a low growling noise, and they turned to see a pack of wild dogs stalking them. The dogs were foaming at the mouth, and their eyes glowed in the darkness. The teenagers ran, but the dogs were too fast, and soon they were surrounded. They fought back, but it was no use. The dogs were too strong, too relentless. As the teenagers lay dying, they saw the spirits of the friends, trapped in the cemetery, their faces twisted in horror and pain. They realized too late that they had awakened something that should have never been disturbed, that they had played with forces beyond their understanding. As their vision faded and the darkness closed in, they heard a voice, cold and ominous, whispering in their ears. "You should have listened to the warnings," the voice said. "Now, you too will be trapped, forever haunted by the horrors you have unleashed."